Do I feel great of having had a hand in helping get him free? Of course not. I feel awful for the family if he did that. There's no question people of color in this country have and continue to be treated in a horrific manner. There is just simply no feeling that comes close to matching being able to restore someone else's life.
First of all, this is my voice. I'm Tim Green, and I have ALS. But this podcast isn't about ALS. I don't want you to feel sorry for me. I don't feel sorry for me. I'm a father of 5, married for over 35 years, a New York Times best-selling author, an NFL first-round pick, and a practicing attorney. This is Nothing Left Unsaid, where my son Troy and I sit down with extraordinary people for raw, honest conversations about life, its toughest trials, and greatest triumphs. My voice in today's episode is powered by 11 Labs. Josh Dubin, you are a criminal justice reform advocate attorney and the executive director of the Perlmutter Center at Cardozo Law. In layman's terms, you try to get people out of jail who have been wrongfully convicted. This is an extremely noble thing to do, but the sword cuts both ways. I want to address the question that I know people will be wondering right out of the gate before we get into the other questions I have for you today. You went on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast in February 2024 with Sheldon Johnson, a man you got out of jail for being wrongfully sentenced. Then, in March, Sheldon was arrested for an especially grisly murder. He allegedly decapitated and dismembered his victim. I know you are probably tired of answering this question, but please tell us a bit about his original case, and then what your thoughts and feelings were after hearing this tragic news. By the way, I watched both episodes and my heart went out to you.
What I knew of Sheldon's original case came from the attorneys that had represented him for years, and from my analysis of the file, which was that Sheldon was involved in, a series of really 2 armed robberies that involved him getting back drug money that was allegedly owed to him. I think during one of the robberies, a gun was fired. He was not alleged to have fired it, and no one was injured. But there were various organizations, the Center for Appellate Litigation, that supported his release. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office supported his release. So this was not a situation where Josh Dubin or the Perlmutter Center for Legal Justice said, oh, this looks like a guy that deserves a second chance. We sort of came in at the last minute and supported his release and helped get it over the finish line. But, knowing what I know now, would I have made a different decision? No. I haven't arrived at that easily. And I appreciate your sentiments, Tim, but your heart shouldn't go out to me. My heart goes out to, because whatever I went through personally is just, that's on me. I don't feel bad for myself and don't want sympathy from anyone, because this is just an unfortunate reality of doing this kind of work, is that there are people that are going to reoffend. We like to think that the people that we helped get a second chance wouldn't reoffend. And if you studied Sheldon on paper, in person, he was recommended by the probation, by the parole board. The Manhattan District Attorney. He had been interviewed many times by people that were far more qualified to assess where he was from a psychological standpoint than I am. And on paper and in real life, every indication was that this is a man that had been not only rehabilitated, but just an extraordinary individual on the inside. I'm not going to comment on his case, because that those are allegations. I know nothing about the facts of that case, and he deserves the same presumption of innocence that is afforded to everybody else in our system. I think one of the biggest problems with the system is that we kid ourselves that there's a presumption of innocence, but there isn't. That's just something we like to say to make each other feel better. There's an assumption of guilt. So I mean the question that I asked during jury selection that bears the most fruit, if a judge will allow me to ask it, is how many of you think that because my client was charged with a crime or indicted, they must have done something wrong? I mean, the hands fly up. We've done studies on this, as have you know others throughout the years. If we're honest with each other, there's no presumption of innocence. So I think it's important to extend him that. Now, do I feel good if he did what they're saying he did? Do I feel great of having had a hand in helping get him free? Of course not. I feel awful for the family if he did that. I feel awful for all involved, but I have to live with the fact that there's only so much I can control. And one thing Joe Rogan has taught me, which is a valuable lesson, is not to read comments on either to his episodes that I'm on or just other comments on social media. I think that it could be a toxic place, and a toxic place to be is starting to read that stuff, good or bad. So I obviously I'm human. I feel awful that if he did that, but I don't know what the situation is, and I have to keep on. I have two choices. I could either go crawl into a hole, which I did for a little while, and stay there, or I could dust myself off and keep doing the work and not let, if he did this, one person or one situation ruin it for so many people that are deserving. I know that's a long-winded answer, but it requires, I think, a thoughtful explanation.
Yeah, and I agree. I also think that I got two questions for you. One is, do you think that the presumption of guilt, really, do you think that's changed over your career, like when you first started versus now? Or do you think people have always felt that way, that where people kind of always assume guilt?
I think that we, since the advent of media, we've assumed guilt, and I think it's gotten worse because in the federal system, judges barely allow attorneys to ask questions during jury selection. They don't even let the attorneys conduct voir dire, which are, for our audience, are the questions that attorneys should be allowed to ask of prospective jurors. And if you've ever tried a case in federal court, there's a race to get it done by lunch. And you think about this, someone's freedom is on the line. And maybe the most critical moment in this case, and you can't ask the question that I just asked. How many of you think he must be guilty? Most federal judges won't allow that. But the short answer to your question, Troy, is that I'm not going to try to figure it out right now. I think I have a theory on it, but there's something innate in us that wants to see our fellow human trip, fall, and be down in the dirt. And, the presumption of innocence is a notion that was sort of conjured up by some great people in legal jurisprudence that really should reflect the best in us, that we give people the benefit of the doubt, that we don't assume that somebody did something just because someone said so, and that really your instinct should be to kind of scrunch up your nose. When someone tells you a story and then you say, who said that? Says who? And you hear that it's someone that likes to tell tall tales, and you say, forget about that. That's the way we should look at the presumption of innocence. Yeah. And instead, we all have to be honest with ourselves. When you hear that someone has been charged with a crime, I think the natural instinct is to say, they must have done something.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
I do
I
think
think
that's
it's gotten
I do think
worse.
it's natural to think that way. I think you have to the presumption of innocence. I think takes more effort than the presumption of guilt. I think it's a lot easier to say, like you just said, well, we're not here for no reason. Even if they didn't do that, they must have done something. I think it's so much easier to say that than to really try and look at it objectively and say, starting in a place of innocence. And then the second question is, I guess I'm curious, and this might sound, I don't know, maybe a little insensitive, but I mean, your role with the whole, thing with Sheldon is, you helped him phase one of, or whatever phase that would be of his life, but for your relationship with him, kind of started and ended at just, getting him out of a situation that he probably shouldn't have been in. I guess in the blowback is kind of like assuming that people are writing comments and saying things online like you were involved and like you helped facilitate it, which obviously you didn't. I don't even see not that I get why you would feel upset about it because it's a very drastic situation, but it's like there's nothing you could have done about that. You don't have any hand in his life post, getting him out of jail.
I mean, look, I don't want to sound like I'm deflecting, but and the blowback I thought was kind of done until Tim asked me that question, and you're asking me, which I'm fine with. I'm fine with it. I mean, I'm not trying to. There's no point in me emphasizing, what you just said, which is the truth. I had very little involvement, but I'm not going to shy away from the fact that as the executive director of my center, I supported it, as did everyone else at my center. Um, no, I did not represent him, even in court on the record. I advocated for him to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. I supported his release. He wasn't even really a fit. I mean, he was my client for those purposes. When he got out, I didn't have nothing to do with him. I got to know him when he got out. He was working at the Queen's Defenders as like a client advocate. All indications were that this is a man that had not only turned himself around, but was a success story. I don't know, and nobody will ever know what was lurking in the dark recesses of this man's mind if he did this. And this is a big if. I don't know what the story is. I don't. I don't know if someone else did it and he was covering up something. I don't know what the evidence is. I don't know anything about it,
Yeah.
but I want to keep emphasizing that. But I don't. Yeah, I can only do so much, and people that do this work can only do so much. And look, we have mental health services for our clients that get out. He was in therapy. Taking advantage of that, but whether it's a combination of what happened to someone in their upbringing or the psychological and psychiatric effects of being incarcerated, unless you've been there and done it, no one really knows what can drive someone to do something terrible if he in fact did it. But I come at this from a place of empathy, but also I have to be realistic. And somebody lost a family member, a father, a brother, a son. You know, so that's just not lost on me. For better or for worse, I wear that stuff on my shirt sleeve. I'm very emotional about it, and I wouldn't be any good at what I do if I wasn't able to see things from all angles. So I there have been lots of other folks that are probably way better lawyers than me and have been doing this work even longer than the 20 plus years I've been doing it, that have had a client reoffend.
Yeah.
And unfortunately it happened, and I think that it is the exception, not the rare exception, and not the rule.
I was fascinated by 2 points of discussion between you and Joe Rogan on JRE. The first was that Sheldon's alleged victim was a fellow inmate who slashed Sheldon's face pretty severely while they were prisoners. That doesn't excuse what Sheldon allegedly did, but it at least would explain it a little more. Do you know if that's true?
I don't know if that's true or not, Tim. I don't know if that's true. That was, and I think I said that on the episode with Joe. That is what I had heard through the grapevine, and I've learned that the grapevine is a grapevine for a reason. It's sometimes it bears fruit worthy of making wine, and sometimes the fruit is rotten. And I don't know if that's good information or not, and I don't really feel comfortable commenting on it because I did not seek to find out any more than was being reported in the press. Because it's just he has great defense lawyers. I think the Bronx defenders are defending him. And I just don't care. I have so much to do on behalf of so many people. We get lots of mail at the Perlmutter Center for legal justice, and I'd really rather focus on that. I'm not running from it. My blood pressure is the precise measure that it was when we started the episode as it is now. Um, I know it's fascinating for folks, but I can't give it too much more energy because, you know, his fate is now sailing in a different direction, whatever the outcome of his case. I just think that the whole situation is unfortunate.
The second thing I keyed in on was your broader discussion about how race is a factual discrepancy when it comes to sentencing and wrongful convictions. Oh, I was also flabbergasted to hear you guys talk about the CIA being responsible for the crack epidemic. I had never heard that before.
Well, the CIA being responsible for the crack epidemic is a theory that Joe Rogan strongly supports. I think that there's seems to be some truth to it. I have not delved into it too much. I mean, there's the story of the real Rick Ross, Freeway Ricky Ross. He's done an episode on Rogan, but I mean, I know that, whether you look at statistics from the Sentencing Project, any wrongful conviction organizations that have taken a look at it, to deny that race plays a role, and an important role in determining who gets arrested, disproportionately sentenced, and has a way more difficult time getting free when it comes to either wrongful convictions or getting out on parole or being granted clemency. There's no question that people of color in this country have and continue to be treated in a horrific manner. And this is such a deep fracture in our society that it is this is not something that will fix itself. I don't pretend to have a solution, but the same founding fathers whose constitution we parade out and swear to uphold as lawyers, many of them had slaves and viewed black people as having less of a right to exist than them simply because of the color of their skin. That does not fix itself. This is a systemic problem. I know that there have been comments online and other places calling me a race baiter and hey, listen, I'm easy to find. I'm not some kind of tough guy, but I'm also not running from the fact that that is a fact, and it is I have seen the the emotional destruction of families that have to live with this reality in the criminal justice system, and the human cost that the disparities in our justice system have on people of color. And I have dedicated my life to doing what I can personally to help make a change. Um, and I don't apologize for that.
If you had a magic wand and you could change one rule, or like how could you even address that?
You know, look, I the case for reparations to me is a good one. Um, I think that's one way you could address it is, we have to tear down our system and rebuild it. But, I recommended this book, which I think should be requisite reading for anyone that is not a person of color in this country, which is the book Cast by Isabel Wilkerson, which, discusses in exquisite detail how America is a caste system, no different from how India was a caste system, and how the Germans tried to base their entire system of discriminating against the Jews prior to World War II and during World War II off of the American caste system. Somehow, somewhere along the way, someone decided that people of color are less than, and that they're, by virtue of the color of their skin, are less of a human being than you, me, and your father. And I don't know how you would fix that, but I think reparations is a good start. There has to be a cataclysmic recognition of the destruction that this has caused. People like to point out these crime statistics about how black people are a smaller percentage of the population at large, but represent such an outsized, percentage of those who are incarcerated. What do you think that's because they have a genetic propensity to commit more crime? No, it's because they're living in a system that is born for them to fail, that is designed for them to fail. The black family unit, the conditions that they're born into, are far different than the family unit and the conditions that you and I are born into. And if you are not recognizing that fact, I think that this is not some controversial idea that Josh Dubin believes. I mean, it's just a fact. So I don't know how to fix it, Troy. I wish I did. And
Yeah.
because it's heartbreaking to, there's a reason why most of our clients are people of color. And it's because, it's a reason why most of the wrongful convictions are of people of color. Because there's this intrinsic bias that goes back hundreds of years. And to ignore that, I think, is just to be living in an alternate reality.
I have not spent much time thinking about this. This is an off the cuff idea, literally right now. If you did trials where the jurors couldn't see the defendant, maybe that takes the human aspect out of it, though, and maybe they'd be more harsh. But I don't know. I'm just thinking if you couldn't see it's kind of like getting a resume and not being able to see. I've seen studies where they did like the name on the resume and how much it got picked up or how many people got calls back. Kind of a similar thing, but I think if you couldn't see that you were sentencing a human, maybe you'd be more likely to do extreme punishment. So maybe that wouldn't work.
Well, I mean, I think you're onto something. There have been experiments about, what segregation did to the psychology of children. I think that there has been what their racial perceptions were. There's the Clark Dolls test, which is an interesting study to read about. I think that, when we find like if you look at any research on implicit bias, any of the sociological studies about race and inequality, you're onto something. But there are other constitutional protections that require you to be able to face your accuser. And it does take the human. But I look, I can tell you that if juries didn't know the race of the defendant, there would be less convictions of people of color.
Yeah, I'm not in this world like you are, so I really don't know.
Well, you're in this world. You're in this world though, because you're in this world.
Right. I'm in this world. I'm not in the world of the criminal defense stuff.
No, but we all are, because I think like society writ large, we're all in this world because we're all making determinations. Um,
I don't know if this is controversial or not, so maybe we'll see. I guess we'll find out. But I also think that there's a big thing here with age. Like I think like if I go like my grandparents, it was so obviously a huge problem. I think with like, my dad's generation, maybe you and my dad's generation, like around your guys' time, I think it's better. It's still a problem, but better than it was for like our grandparents' age, right? I think for my generation or like the generation, the decade, a decade plus or minus my age, I think it's a lot less. It's still a problem, but it seems like it's, in my totally uneducated opinion, it seems like it's so much better than it was. If you compare a lot of the stuff that existed with like racism, sexism, stuff like that, of course it still exists, and of course it's still a problem. But there's a lot of things with, I don't know, problems that I read about or heard about that I never experienced as obviously a white man, but I had, a lot of teammates, a lot of friends that were black and didn't have, and I'm sure they experienced things that I didn't see, but a lot of times my experiences with them, it wasn't as, what's the right word? There wasn't as much like racial tension in the areas that I was in, but I was also, my interactions was predominantly in safer spaces, whether it was, my house, my dorm room, our locker room, the university, stuff like that. So maybe it's not a good example, but I would have thought before we started talking, I would have thought like in the beginning of your career, it was a lot worse than it was today, but maybe it's not the case.
I mean, listen, my view on this is no more or less valid than yours. That's just your lived experience. I don't think it's gotten better. I think it's just changed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that what the subjects of the Clark Doll test study, which these subjects were between the ages of 3 and 7, and what it concluded is that racism, segregation, prejudice had a very profound psychological effect on children in that age range, and it created a sense of inferiority amongst them. So that's no less today than it was 50 years ago. It's just different. I mean, when you have, and there's a lot, that I agree with the current administration on. There's a heck of a lot I disagree about, and I think that we're a society that grabs headlines and, makes an assumption and runs in one direction with it. Like, for instance, you hear a lot about critical race theory, and, one side thinks it's important and the other side thinks that it has no place in our schools. Critical race theory is just teaching American history. That's what critical race theory is, and not just through the white lens. How can that be harmful? I want my children to know what happened to their friends that are of color's ancestors. I don't want that whitewashed. And I just, what troubles me is that I think that we're taking steps backward right now by acting as if things are getting better, but that's just my opinion, Troy. I mean, I don't. You had a different lived experience. I think you'd be
Sure.
hard pressed if you asked some of your African American friends. Do you ever feel discriminated against? Ask them.
Yeah.
Have
No,
you ever
I'm
been
not
looked
saying it
at?
doesn't. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen, and I know it has happened and continues to happen. I'm saying that I guess this would be the question that I would ask. If I would ask my friends, I think what would sound better. Have you been discriminated against by people under the age of X? That's what I think. That would be my guess. And again, I've never asked. I'll have to ask them and I'll get back to you. I'll shoot you a text. But that would be my guess would be if you said, have you been discriminated by people under the age of, and I don't know the age, 35, 40 years old? My guess would be like the person who was being discriminatory towards them would be over that age the vast majority of the time, but maybe not. I don't know.
I think you'd be. I think you'd be. I think that it happens plenty, and I don't think that it's like a southern thing. I think that it happens all over the place, and I think that you got to remember that the children that you grew, I mean, the kids that you grew up with are the children of parents that held certain views. And I know from being a parent that your children are often a product of, their upbringing and the values instilled upon them by their parents. So I think that it's not an accident that you're a curious, introspective, intelligent guy because you had your dad as an example. So
Yeah.
you have to, and I'm sure that there are things about the way your dad brought you up that you're like, I'm not going to do that when I'm a dad. I know for me, I've dealt with that in therapy.
Yeah.
And you hope you take the good and try to improve upon it going forward. But I think to deny that or to trick ourselves that it's getting better, when you have a president that is, you know, say, it's so weird because he does so many things that you're like, this is great. It's against convention, and it's real talk. And then there'll be some moronic dog whistle about somebody's ethnicity or something. But so it's kind of hard to sort that out. But I think that it's empowered, some folks to do and say things that they may not have otherwise felt comfortable doing or saying.
Well, thanks for knocking out those questions about Sheldon. Now, the fun stuff. I wanted to ask you more about your background and how you even got into this. You've spent much of your life helping others find justice. Where does that deep sense of purpose come from? Was there a moment that changed everything for you?
That's a great question, Tim. I think some of it comes from feeling misunderstood as a kid. I was always, I always had a lot of existential angst. I was the 11-year-old that was like, laying awake in bed at night wondering like, so what does happen when we die? And if how did this all happen? And what is space? I was like plagued with like questions that there was never going to be an answer to. And I don't think that there was one thing in particular, but I do think that it was a combination of my parents. My dad was a knock around Brooklyn guy that had a lot of heart and soul. He could never say no to someone with their hand out. It was just in his DNA. And my mom was a school teacher. And, they were both just helpers and givers. And my dad had his struggles personally, financially, and otherwise, but at the nerve root of it all was he loved people and he loved to give. You know, I remember being home from college for Thanksgiving and my dad going to Home Depot and to get a light bulb that burnt out in the dining room. And he came home with two young black men that were selling electronics in the parking lot on Thanksgiving. And, he asked them, don't you guys aren't you doing Thanksgiving? And he brought them home to my house. Did my mom think it was weird? She's like, yeah, of course she did. She's like, what the fuck are you doing? And, my dad was such that was just like who he was. He was always taking in people that he thought needed help, and then, my mom was just trying to, she taught kids with learning disabilities. And I think from an early age, what if I could put like my finger on one thing, I saw that if you give, I mean, this extended from a bouncer outside of a nightclub or a bar to a teacher or a school administrator or to a run-in with a cop. If you give someone a little bit of authority, in my mind, the very vast majority of the time, they're going to test the limits of it and try to abuse it. And that always bothered me. I mean, I remember being guilty of it myself when I became a safety patrol and wearing the orange thing and the belt in 5th grade. And, well, I was like, this feels good. Get back in line. So I always had this sense that kind of authority and power was a force of corruption. And then, as a young lawyer, I'll tell you how I got into this. I got real lucky early on. I was somehow got the reputation as this expert on picking juries. When I was in law school, I hated it. I was about to quit, and the dean of my law school put me together with a woman that taught the psychology of jury selection at my law school. Between my first and second year in law school and second and third year, she took me under her wing and taught me all the social psychology and sent me out to pick juries on my own. And she would say, listen, if they don't ask you, don't tell them you're in law school. You picked up, I feel comfortable that you know who we need to get rid of, what questions to ask. And by some circuitous and fortuitous path, I ended up picking a jury in New York City for like these legends of the criminal defense bar. I mean, here I am in my mid-20s, late 20s. I mean, I was like 26 at the time. And Jerry Shargell, Gus Newman, Jerry Lefcourt, Barry Scheck. These guys were like I had read about them. Jerry Lefcourt was a guy that represented Abby Hoffman and Afeni Shakur. He represented the Black Panthers at the Black Panther trial and got them acquitted. And he saw something in me at a young age. So Jerry Lefcourt convinced his co-counsel in a 6 or 7 defending case in the Eastern District of New York in Brooklyn to allow me to help pick the jury. And they all got acquitted and then blamed it on me. So I became like, the conviction rate is so high in federal court that I became this like, you got to hire this young whiz kid. So I remember I got a voicemail. I must have been 27. I had just gone out on my own to start this trial strategy firm. And I got a voicemail from Barry Sheck. And I thought I never returned the call because I thought it was my brother playing a joke on me, because when I was in college, I went to Florida State. When I was in college, the O.J. Simpson trial was the thing to watch. That was our reality TV. And we used to like have nicknames for all the lawyers. I didn't want to be a lawyer back then. It was just like, I mean, I remember where I was, as I'm sure you do, Tim, when the verdict got read. So I thought it was a joke. And I didn't return the call. And about a week or so later, I got a call from Jerry Lefcourt. And he said, "What the fuck is the matter with you? I refer Barry Sheck to you and you don't return his call." And I said, "Oh no, I thought that was my brother." So in any event, I end up meeting with Barry, who was one of the founders of the Innocence Project. And he and his colleagues started a civil rights firm. And they didn't really have much experience with civil rights cases or civil law because they were criminal defense lawyers. And they asked me to help them on a civil rights case. And I started doing a lot of work with him. And that's how I got involved with the Innocence Project. I ended up moving into their office space. They invited me to be their suite mate. And I just started that way. And it was like, so I didn't find it, it kind of found me. And I was drunk on it right away. I mean, it was like, it checked all the boxes. You're fighting authority, tall odds, people that need help, that are in an extraordinarily vulnerable position. And I just fell in love with it that way.
You're behind the scenes in some of the most high stakes legal battles in the country. What's that pressure like, and how do you stay grounded?
I think it's healthy to feel that pressure, because when someone's liberty is on the line, and again, watching the impact that a criminal prosecution has on families, it's not just the person accused, but on spouses and children and extended family. It upends a life. And for an empath like me, it's not difficult to feel the pressure, and to keep it, or I think better put, the challenge is keeping it in a healthy place, because I don't want it to start bleeding over into my home life, although it inevitably does. How I stay grounded is I have to constantly, remind myself that I have a very different perspective on who we should be looking up to in our society. Like, I don't understand who made the financial pecking order when we built our economy, but in my mind, my mom should have made a lot more money as a school teacher than I've ever made as a lawyer. I think that her impact on people is far more profound. So in terms of staying grounded, I suffered an ego death. And suffering an ego death, I think, is the best way to stay grounded. I took, there were things about myself that I did not like. And through a series of tragedies in my life, I decided that it would be an appropriate time to take a look in the mirror and really dig into who the hell I was. And, so for me, it's much easier to stay grounded. I don't post much on social media unless it's about a cause or a case. And, I don't get too high or too low. And I know that our time here is fleeting. Um, I have 3 children, and I try to spend every waking moment with them and my wife and the people that are closest to me. So staying grounded has never been a challenge for me. I mean, have I ever had periods where I was like walking through an airport and I mean, this was like the peak of my notoriety was like, being stopped in an airport and someone asked to take a picture of me. And, you know, I was like, wow, that felt good. But what felt way better was that my son and daughter, my oldest daughter, was standing next to me, and my son, and the person said, I really appreciate what you're doing for our community. So that meant way more to me than someone saying, hey, can I get a picture with you? Because let's face it, they were getting a picture of me because they, if you're famous for being on Joe Rogan a bunch, that's not really famous. That's just like, that's like, that's like so nuts. And I've had a couple of people that have been like, I've seen you on 2020 or I saw you on CNN. I don't really have a desire I turn most media requests down. So I don't really have a desire to be famous. It sounds like most famous people I know are fucking miserable or feel like they don't know who to trust. They don't have, friends are hard to come by. So good luck, Tim, getting a concise answer from me.
Josh, you could have easily taken your success and stayed comfortable, but you chose to fight for the wrongfully convicted. Why? What pulled you in?
I've said this before, and I guess I'll repeat it. I don't think there's any drug, certainly no booze or wine or beer, or feeling outside of like watching my daughters ride horses or my son get a big hit in a baseball game, or like my wedding day, the day my kids were born. Outside of all of those things, there is just simply no feeling that comes close to matching being able to restore someone else's life and to give somebody back something that was taken from them. And I have a friend who was wrongfully convicted, and he has likened it to being, his name is JJ Velasquez. He has an amazing story. He was exonerated in Manhattan recently. He's in the movie Sing Sing. He's one of the actors, and he's got an amazing podcast with a great journalist named Dan Slepian. And he said, Josh, I got kidnapped off a street corner and descended into a nightmare that's, way beyond what I could fathom. So, I'm not doing this for Instagram likes. And I'm not doing this so that I could go tell people what a great person I am. I'm doing this because I think that it's my duty actually to do this. And I don't know if it's a calling from some higher power, whatever you want to call it. I just think that if we're not here to help our fellow human, what are we doing here? So some people go to soup kitchens or, give back in other ways. Philanthropy makes me feel whole, but you don't feel the tangible results of that always. This is living, breathing, and grinding through the human experience with someone who often has lost hope, Tim, and you're that flicker of light in the darkness for them, and to be able to help them restore it. I I'm a crier in court, and it is genuine every single time, because I start to, like I said, being an empath has its pluses and minuses. I start to feel those emotions of what they must be going through. And when I represented Clemente Aguirre in Florida, and I had the actual murderer on the witness stand and got her about as close as you could get to confessing that she did this, um, committed 2 murders that he was convicted for. Um, you know, to have the state of Florida drop the case and to physically be able to walk him out of prison after 12 years, 10 of which were on death row, there's just no feeling like it. I don't know how to describe it, but the closest thing that I can describe, that I can liken it to, is being high in a way that drugs were not involved. So, like, when I hit my first home run over the fence in Little League, not like a roller. In Red Hook in Brooklyn, they call it the Red Hook roll because there's no fence and rolls to the fence. But when I hit one over the fence, I remember going to school as a 7th grader and feeling like I was floating. I don't know why the home run did that to me, but that's what this feels like at times 50. So I guess that's the selfish part of it.
Yeah, but you're saving someone's life. I mean, it's different than the medical sense, but you really are. I mean, you're pulling, and the fact that they're wrongfully there too, it adds a whole nother element.
Yeah, and it's messy too sometimes because, we talked earlier about Sheldon, but this is messy. When people get out after being wrongfully convicted, it's literally impossible for them not to have deep psychological scars. So when they get out, it's not like they're like, all right, well, here I am back in society.
Yeah.
Oh, this is an iPhone? This is cool. There's a real struggle that goes on. And, sometimes you get taken advantage of. And, if you get too close with the client and, you are looked at as their savior, their savior. And, I've had to put some guardrails in place over the years to make sure that there are appropriate boundaries. But, the deputy director of my center, of the Perlmutter Center, is named Derek Hamilton. He was incarcerated for 22 years for a murder he didn't commit, and he's sort of a force of nature. And he's had his struggles since he's been out, but being around somebody like that not only helps me stay grounded, but reminds me that, look, this isn't always a straight path. And, you have to be patient, and you have to be constantly reminded that being human is messy stuff in the first place. And you throw being locked in a cage against your will for something you didn't do in the mix. That's deep.
You never really hear about that transition. Josh, what keeps you going when the system feels stacked against you? Have you ever felt like giving up?
Man, that's the best question. I would be lying if I didn't say I felt like this is so fucking unfair. How do we resolve this? What next? And I'm not saying this to be like some feel-good story. I'm not saying this because I don't fucking give up. I won't give up. I feel like when the system is stacked against me, I feel like it's almost like someone saying, you're no good at this sport. I'm like, okay, Okay, now it's on. So I have to tell you, the more unfair a situation is, the more energized I get. I get like more creative and because I know that when the system starts to act in a way that it's covering the truth, then there's more incentive for me to expose it. So I am not the kind of person that, and this is unfortunate for my mental and physical health and for all the gray hair in my beard. But it is fortunate for my clients is that I'm not leaving someone behind. I don't have it in me to do that. So I'm dealing with a situation right now with these 4 guys in Ohio where they are stone cold innocent. The person that accused them of committing this murder has said, I lied and made the whole thing up. The DA, who I talked about the case, I talked about the case on Rogan, but they call him the prosecuting attorney, heard the Rogan episode, was flooded with phone calls, met with me, ends up agreeing to vacate these convictions, does so, and then judges like pump the brakes. The new prosecuting attorney comes in and undoes the whole thing with no explanation other than that he wants to review it. And you come to find out that his mentor was the guy that prosecuted these men, and has been involved in other wrongful convictions, and apparently. So I know I'm just getting closer to the truth. So I'm not leaving the Ohio 4 behind. I can't. What does that say about me? Because I have been in situations where I've been told you'll never be able to get these people out. No one will listen to you. Look, hey, we're all human. And I know what I'm fighting against. I'm fighting against this tribal inability to admit that you were wrong. That's it. You ever been in an argument? This has happened to me with my wife.
How do you explain to someone outside the legal world just how easy it is to be wrongfully convicted in America?
I tell them stories about the cases I'm working on. That's the only way I know how. I give them examples of people that have spent decades in prison for crimes they didn't commit. And they say, well, how could that be? And I send them materials to read about it.
This is probably a really ignorant question, but do you think things like as blatant as like the Lorraine 4, is that still happening today? Or is that things that people got away with decades ago because so many people didn't have a voice then?
No, I think that it happens every day. I think that the system is set up for human beings to allow their own shit to interfere. So in other words, we all have egos and we all want to win. So if you're a prosecutor, it's a binary thing, right? It's either you're going to win or lose. And, a lot of times prosecutors don't have the ones that are trying the case don't have the decision-making authority to say, I don't believe in this case. They're charged with going out there and saying, here's your charge, soldier, go win. Oftentimes, I don't think that they're out to frame someone. And I think that the very vast majority of the time, police are not out to frame someone. I think that they allow hunch to replace evidence, and they backfill and reverse engineer, and I think it happens every day because as long as we're human, it's very difficult for us as human beings to admit that we made a mistake. And as long as that is going to be an issue, and there's a whole mix of other factors, concern about speaking up to authority, well, my supervisor thinks that they must have done it. There is, various forms of confirmation bias that are happening. So for instance, if a fingerprint analyst who is physically sitting at the police department, and the detective says, here's who we think it is. Can you verify this set of prints are the ones that were found at the crime scene? The likelihood that they're going to find a match has increased dramatically. So sometimes they're doing it and they don't even realize they're doing it, which is why we have, reform efforts at the Perlmutter Center with our director of reform, Sarah Chu, formerly of the Innocence Project. And there's so many great people that are out there trying to get laws changed. But no, I think that until we understand and have a deeper understanding of just how fallible things like eyewitness testimony are, just how fallible blood spatter evidence is, just how fallible bite mark evidence is, until there's a deeper understanding of things like that, of how, fraught with uncertainty and invalid, unscientific results most disciplines of forensic science are, until there's widespread acceptance of that, we're going to have wrongful convictions.
What percentage do you think it is? I mean, it's a very small percentage, right? Or I think, am I wrong about that?
I don't know, that's asking, how do you know what you don't know? I don't know how many wrongful convictions, there are people that have estimated it, and I don't know how they estimate it, but, if you Google it, like I just did, it's, Google's AI says it's anywhere between 2 to 10%, which suggests 46,000 to 230,000 people currently incarcerated may be innocent. Some experts estimate the range should be as high as 15.4%. That is astonishingly high. So I'm not going to start, there have been studies about it, but I have not been involved in those studies. All I know is we get a case, we investigate it, and we make a decision at our center whether or not we think it's worthy of reinvestigation, and then whether we think the person may be actually innocent. And you unfortunately oftentimes have to push the boulder uphill because you're fighting the powers that be, and the Ohio 4 case is a great example of that. There's no reason 2 of those 4 men are still sitting in prison. 2 of them did so much time that they paroled out. And, they still have these wrongful convictions looming over them. But, my client, John Edwards, is still rotting in a prison and shouldn't be. We've been given no explanation by the prosecuting attorney why he withdrew the vacating of those convictions. But we're going to stay on it and aggressively pursue their release.
Does going on Joe Rogan and talking about the Ohio 4, does that help, or does that gum things up? Does that all that media pressure make them speed up, or do they dig their heels in?
I think the platform that Joe has given me has been invaluable. I think that it has led to the exoneration of several people. And I think that every prosecutor or elected official that says that they don't care about the media pressure is telling a outright lie. Of course it helps. I don't think it gums anything up because it does a few things. It spreads awareness. It gets other people activated to help out. And, of course they feel pressure, because if these stories don't see the light of day, then, these are elected officials. If the stories don't see the light of day, then, it's very hard to have a local prosecutor feeling pressured that unless they do something to rectify the situation, that, their political future might be in doubt. And I just think that it's troubling that more people don't get involved. And like for all your listeners, write to prosecuting attorney Tony Sillo, demand the release of the Ohio 4. You can look at all of the evidence for yourself. I posted on a website, freetheohio4.com. I just think that it's there are so many cases that people advocate for, and you come across a case every several years where you're like, this is really, really troubling, because there's literally zero evidence linking these men to this crime, except for the paid testimony of a known police informant that has gone in and told the FBI, I made the whole thing up, who the U.S. Secret Service used to use as an informant, and told the very prosecutor in that case, I want you to know that this informant is not reliable. And we found out that he's taking money from us in exchange for coming up with bullshit stories, and we're investigating him. And that yet they continue to stand by the conviction. I think part of what motivates it is not only their unwillingness to say that they did something wrong, but the fear of a civil suit. So that should never be what drives people. Is fear that the municipality is going to get sued, but they're protecting their interests.
Why did you break with the Innocence Project? Also, I've heard you say that the law should be about truth, not just winning. But in the real world, how often is that the case?
I left the Innocence Project because I was really I was like a utility infielder there. I was did it all pro bono, and they would use me for various different things. And I had an opportunity to run my own center. I think that the Innocence Project mainly focuses on DNA cases, and I wanted to be able to work on different types of cases and run my own program, and had the opportunity to do that and took it. The second question was, it's hard to answer because I think that the truth is a stubborn thing. And I think that the truth ultimately rears its head. How often the trial I think the trial is about winning or losing to the lawyers a lot of times. And when the trial becomes about winning or losing too much, even in the face of the truth, I'll never forget what the judge said in the Clementi Aguirre case. During the trial, at some point, he said to the prosecutors, he's to the state of Florida, I think that sometimes you have to, it was something along the lines of sometimes what you thought was the truth, you have to recognize can change. And I think that the prosecutor should really consider that. And I think that was his gentle way of telling them, you might want to reconsider proceeding with this case. And we need more Judge Galuzzo's in this world. He was the judge that I think recognized what was happening in real time, and, had the courage to speak up and say something while it was unfolding. So I think that, in wrongful conviction cases, it becomes less about the truth, right? And I think it becomes more about the win or preserving the conviction. And that to me is unacceptable and heartbreaking.
You've seen junk science destroy lives. What's one moment that made you realize how broken that system is?
I read a lot about the case of someone named Cameron Todd Willingham. And this was a case where he was accused of, setting fire to his home and killing his children. And Cameron Todd Willingham was executed, and I think that he was innocent, as do many others. And the more I read about his case, and you can, there's plenty of stuff out there online about it, but, Cameron Todd Willingham was, in the home. He escaped and went back in to try to get his kids out. And the prosecutor in the case based his beliefs regarding Mr. Willingham's motive on posters that he had on his wall of, bands of like heavy metal bands. I mean, I'm not making this up. This was like some of the most bizarre stuff. And some of the bands he liked, I'm trying to remember which bands they were, but it was like, oh, if that is motive to commit a crime like that, then there's a lot of people that have motive to commit murder. And they developed this theory that he was somehow, a Satan worshiper. And, it was so bizarre, and it was so beyond, reason the theory that they pieced together. And, a lot of what prosecutors thought they knew about arson and the intentional setting of fires was upended. So in other words, they would look at characteristics of the scene after the fire and almost invariably would attribute a certain characteristic to the use of an accelerant. So in other words, crazed glass, which is like the breaking of glass in a certain pattern. The alligatoring of surfaces, which is like an alligator pattern. Various different things. And they came to learn, forensic scientists came to learn that those same characteristics appear in unintentionally set fires. So the National Academy of Sciences put out a report in 2009 that goes through this in pristine detail as it relates to various disciplines of forensic science. And many of the theories that were put forth before a jury in Texas in the Cameron Todd Willingham case are now known to be scientifically unsound. So I can point to that because I was, this is in my early studying about arson, where I was like, how could this be possible? I also remember like having a real sort of like, holy shit, this is how bad it is when I learned about bite mark evidence and how unreliable it is. And it's still admissible in all 50 states. And it's, the NAS report is something good for folks to read because that should have been a watershed moment. That should have turned the criminal justice system on its head. And it didn't, unfortunately. And it was like an earth-shattering event in the forensic science community that somehow did not reverberate into the courts.
What's one change we could make tomorrow that would save lives and prevent injustice?
Here's one practical change. Every state should require that a crime lab is not in the same geographic location as the police department. That's a practical one. State legislators can pass legislation that require Two things. One, that crime labs are not viewed as an arm of law enforcement, because this problem of confirmation bias is a very real one, right? They're telling them who the suspect is. They're telling a latent print examiner, here's who we think it is. And number two, that every lab gets certified and that there's a uniform set of standards that they follow and they are audited, and we have, again, some uniformity in how forensic evidence is tested and, what the guidelines are for admitting it into courts and throughout our country. Those are two easy, practical solutions that would be game changers. And they seem simple, right? They seem like, those are no-brainers, but it happened in the Clementi Aguirre case, the latent print examiner that says that his palm print was on the knife that the state argued was the murder weapon. It turns out that the print couldn't be attributed to anyone, but the detective went and told the latent print examiner that it was his print, goes with the latent print examiner into the jail where he's being held to get the print. And, the likelihood of her falsely implicating him and attributing the print to him, again, went up by 80%. So I think educating law enforcement, lab analysts about confirmation bias, also really important things.
What do you think jurors get wrong most often, and what do lawyers underestimate about them?
I think that, I don't know what they get wrong most often, but I know that they equate someone being called an expert with being right in a criminal case and being some sort of authority figure. You can go, there's a great article by an investigative journalist called Pamela Koloff. She's remarkable. And she writes for ProPublica. She went and became a certified blood spatter analyst in 1 week. Some of these so-called experts become experts by taking a correspondence class over a 40-hour, period where they're sitting putzing around on a computer. And, when you start to call someone an expert and speak in a language that is foreign to most jurors, I think juries get it wrong often when they assume that they know what they're talking about. And that's a problem that has to be fixed. And, it requires better lawyering by public defenders who, in many instances, do a much better job than they're given credit for. So I think that is one thing that they get wrong often.
What's been your proudest moment, and conversely, what's haunted you the most?
That's a great question. I think my proudest moment, I'm assuming as a lawyer, my proudest moment as a lawyer was, I can't equate, I cannot substitute one for the other, but every time I was able to restore somebody's freedom were extraordinarily proud moments for me. Ron Torres, Washington, in Lawrence, Kansas, was an extraordinarily proud moment because I knew he was innocent, and I did not think I was getting the attention of the district attorney, but I finally got through to them, and I think that they realized that that somebody else committed the crime, and I thought that he was he had other issues going on in his life, and that were profoundly sad, and he had he had he had a rough life as it was, and this was the last thing that he needed. I think that was a proud moment to be able to deliver that news. I think that of course, Clemente Aguirre, Albert Wilson, is another one that I think stands out to me. But they're all, important, and I'm, extremely proud of all of them. The moment that haunts me the most, I won't name the case. But there's this one cross-examination where, in a criminal case, where I cross-examined this guy for about an hour and a half, and I caught him in a bunch of little lies, and I made him look bad, and it probably would have been way more effective for me to stand up and to say, "You've never met my client, correct?" And the answer would have been correct. "You had never heard his name before this trial, correct?" Correct. And sat down. And I think as a lawyer, sometimes you get so caught up in the advocacy and, thinking you have to make every witness look bad. That moment, that cross-examination has haunted me for years, because I would love to be able to go get it back. And I think sometimes less is more. So the other thing that haunts me is that James Daly is still sitting on death row in Florida for a crime that I think that I was able to demonstrate that he's innocent of. But the courts have not allowed the truth to be presented, and they keep barring it on procedural grounds over and over and over again.
If someone listening wants to help fix the justice system but doesn't know where to start, what would you tell them?
I would tell them to start getting involved in a particular case and start immersing yourself in it to the point where you can have your voice heard. So one great place to start is writing a letter to Tony Sillo, who's the Lorain County prosecutor. And I feel like writing a letter to Tony Sillo and asking him why he won't free the Ohio 4 is a great place to start. He can be reached by sending an email. If you just look him up, his name is Tony, Tony, Sillo, Cillo. And I mean, I don't know, if you want to read about the case first and make sure that you agree that these guys are innocent, go to freetheohio4.com. I think that, and if it's not that case, it could be something else. But I think that actually writing letters, writing emails, getting involved, that all helps.
Do you believe that everyone deserves a second chance, or are there limits?
Wow, that's a tough one. You should have a podcast, Tim.
It's called Nothing Left Unsaid for a reason.
What's that Brian Stevenson quote? Everyone is better than the worst thing they've done. I I think that we all deserve a second chance. Should there be limits? Of course, because I think that, depending on, how heinous the crime, how what the individual has done to actually um, rehabilitate themselves, express remorse. Um, and I'm not the person that makes that decision. I have an opinion sometimes on, the fact that certain people deserve a second chance, and I'm not always right. Um, I think that it takes a a willingness to not sit in judgment, because we can be harsh critics of others, and we've all made mistakes, some worse than others. But I think that when you see someone that has really put the time and energy and effort into changing, and you see the programs that they've gone through while they've been incarcerated, and you take into account their life circumstances leading up to the incarceration, all of those things matter. So I I think that people generally deserve a second chance. Yes. I don't know about a third and a fourth chance, but
You work closely with exonerees and train young lawyers. What's the biggest lesson you try to pass on?
yeah, at the Perlmutter Center for Legal Justice at Cardozo, we have a clinical program where we teach law students how to reinvestigate cases and hopefully get to the truth. And we also have the forensic college where we have lawyers that come and learn the latest about, the admissibility of different um, disciplines of forensic science, how to challenge what we feel is junk science, and so forth. But in working with young lawyers, mentoring young lawyers, the thing that I teach them that I think is the most important lesson that I learned from the greatest criminal defense attorneys is to be malleable, is to have a willingness and an openness for accepting a different version of what you think happened, and not allow your hunch to overtake wherever the investigation leads you.
Josh, who are the Perlmutters and how did you meet them?
So the Perlmutters it's Ike and Lori Perlmutter. Ike was the former chairman of Marvel Entertainment. And the way that we met is sort of fascinating, but they were accused of a crime they didn't commit. And these are, folks that are in their 80s now. This case has been going on for, I think, 12 or 13 years, where they were accused by a neighbor of writing letters to the community about the neighbor, accusing him of being a murderer and a child molester and all sorts of awful things. And they were subpoenaed to appear at a deposition during which their DNA was stolen by this neighbor and analyzed, and they were falsely implicated in sending these letters. And a criminal investigation was opened into them, and a civil lawsuit was filed against them. And I got involved in the case, and sort of helped unravel the junk science that they were relying on, because there can even be, unfortunately, there are aspects to DNA testing that, if you're not actually relying on reliable data, it's very dangerous. And I was able to sort of help unravel the problems with the DNA in the case, and got the case against them dismissed. So the perlmutters, because the real perpetrator of these letters, sending these vile hate mail letters, was arrested in Canada. And in any event, they realized that without resources, it's very difficult to fight an accusation. And we formed a very, very strong bond. They became like family to me. And we ended up, they said, if you get the role as the executive director, we will fund the center for the first 15 years. And they made good on that promise.
15 years is quite the commitment. You've built something powerful there. What do you hope the center accomplishes long after you've gone?
Well, what I hope it accomplishes is not only restoring the freedom of the people that deserve it, but, teaching young lawyers the awesome responsibility and opportunity they have to speak truth to power, and to hopefully create a sea change in the way prosecutors look at a set of facts and a prosecution. We don't want to just arm and equip criminal defense attorneys. We want to teach people that want to become prosecutors to say something if you see something wrong, to have that healthy conversation with a supervisor and say, I'm not so sure we're right about this. We might have assumed that somebody did something that they didn't do. And to create a discourse where there's not an us versus them mentality, which is often the dynamic between prosecutors and defense lawyers. So, empowering people to speak up, because I think that if you don't empower people to speak up, they're going to continue to accept the status quo. So that's sort of, what I hope lasts.
I'm not sure if you're religious at all, but Christianity is something that has personally helped me make sense of my ALS diagnosis and really bring a sense of stability in my life. First, I ask without judgment, do you have a strong faith? I imagine it would be really useful in your line of work. Regardless, has the justice system ever made you question that faith or really lean hard into it?
He won't mind that I say it because he's, very outspoken about it publicly. Andre Ward, who I think is one of the best boxers to ever live. I managed him along with James Prince for much of his career. He is a devout Catholic, devout Christian. And we speak about religion a lot. I wish I had the same conviction he did and that you do. I really do. I wish I felt it. And, I was born into the Jewish faith. My wife is Christian. And we made the decision to raise our kids non-denominational and to let them choose and teach them as much as we can about all religions. In my experience, religion seemed to separate people more than bring them together. And I struggle with it a lot, not just because of what I see in the criminal justice system, but if God was omniscient and all-knowing and all-powerful, I have a hard time understanding how that God would allow slavery to have happened, or children to become afflicted with cancer, or the Holocaust to have occurred. And, there doesn't seem to be much rhyme or reason to it. One of the best human beings I know was recently diagnosed with leukemia, with ALS, someone very close to me. And I have a hard time with why bad things happen to great people. And that extends to you. I don't know how you summon the strength to do what you're doing now. Um, I don't. I wish I could tap into it, but I know myself well enough to know um, I'm not sure I could. I'd like to think I'd be able to, but yeah, the justice system has not helped. Um, it has not helped. It's done more to shake my faith than it has, or my search for faith than it has strengthened. Because I actually don't think that these are happy endings. When they're viewed that way on the news and in the media, and they're celebrated when someone walks out of prisons after having lost decades of their life. Um, but that's just the happy moment that they see in this courtroom scene where someone is released. They don't see what happens in the days, weeks, months, years after that, which is a heck of a lot of suffering unnecessarily, or what happened for the decades before, you know, children fading in and out of lives, with no father. Um, it's heartbreaking. So it's something that I'm still struggling with and searching for.
One of the things I like to do at the end of each podcast is to ask our guests to brag about their families. So please brag away.
This is easy for me. But I try not to be that dad always bragging about their kids. Um, eh, because, that's not very original. So I'm going to start by bragging about my mom. My mom has, taught me the power of making a difference in someone's life, and at a young age. And I remember as a kid going out to dinner, and we moved from New York to Florida when I was real young, and I was, grew up in Fort Lauderdale until I moved away after law school. Um, we'd go out to dinner, and someone would come up to her, and it would be like someone in their 20s and give my mom a big hug and say, "You made such a difference in my life," as a fourth grade teacher. And I thought that was about the coolest damn thing in the world. So my mom taught me that you can have an impact on someone by virtue of being there for them and supporting them. And I think that is part of why I do what I do. And listen, my wife and I have, like any married couple, had ups and downs. But we've been together almost 20 years, and we have made our priority in life to raise three human beings that are empathetic, curious, creative, and want to give back as their currency. And I think that I have to pat us both on the back and say we're doing a great job. Like, my oldest daughter is just an old soul and just extraordinarily inquisitive and creative and dynamic. My son is, the same way, and watching him work as hard as he's working for something that he wants is really, really inspiring. I didn't work anywhere near as hard as he did at 12, 13 years old. And my youngest daughter is just like a fearless firecracker, quick-witted, you know, the most infectious smile you'll ever see. So, I don't do family, excuse me. I don't do dinners with clients. I proudly say, I'm sorry, I'll have lunch or breakfast with you because I did do dinners with my family. So I'm a geek that way, I guess, because I love my family so much. We have a blast together, and this will turn into a Rogan episode if you let me, because I'll brag and brag and brag. So thanks for the offer. Um,
Now on to our final word segment, where we ask our guests a few rapid fire questions. What was the happiest moment in your life?
the day I got married,
What is the biggest adversity you've faced?
the death of my father,
What are you most excited about?
continuing to free innocent people, and watching my kids grow up.
What advice would you give yourself in high school?
Man, I've wanted to talk to that kid for a long time. Um, be less concerned with what the people around you think and more concerned with what you think of yourself.
That's a good one. What book recommendations do you have for us or the listeners?
Cast by Isabel Wilkerson.
I wrote that one down. I'm gonna check it out.
The name of our podcast is Nothing Left Unsaid. Do you have anything you want to say?
I think that I've said it a few times. What has stuck with me from this episode is the bond between a father and a son, and I think that I got some gasoline from the episode to throw on my fire, because you being able to conduct the podcast in your circumstance, Tim, I understand why, to a person, anyone that I've asked about you just says you're a wonderful human being, because I think you had to be that way before to end up, not allowing this to get in your way. So I have deep gratitude for being included as a guest, and I see that the apple fell close to the tree, because Troy, you have just a remarkable affect, and if I could ever be of any help to either of you, and especially you as a young lawyer, Troy, I'm a phone call away.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. And thanks for coming on. Josh, before we let you go, I forgot one thing. At the end of every podcast, I ask our guests, now you kind of know us and know what we're doing and kind of our, what we're about. Who are a couple of people that you know personally you think we should try to get on the podcast?
Derek Hamilton, who is the deputy director of the Perlmutter Center.
Mm-hmm.
JJ Velasquez would be a great one too. He's an exoneree and did just wonderful things when he was in Sing Sing and out. And I love exonerees because I love seeing how they've reinvented themselves.
Yeah.
And have become these amazing advocates in their own right. There's a really amazing criminal defense lawyer named David Marcus, who I think is the best living criminal defense lawyer of our time. And he has his own podcast, which is really cool. It's called For the Defense. He has a very unique perspective on all of the issues that we talked about today.
Yeah, those are all great ones.
Yeah.
Josh, one thing I wanted to say before we wrap up is how important your role is in society. The legal system is right the vast majority of the time, but when it's not, it's a cruel beast that can ruin people's lives. The sad part is most of the time that injustice is done to people who are already vulnerable. I just wanted to thank you for sticking your neck out there and trying to give a voice to a group of people that need it. I know it must bring a lot of criticism your way and that you don't have to be doing it. So again, thank you for that. And thank you for coming on the podcast today. I really appreciated getting to know your story and how you think. I hope God continues to bless you and your family.
Thank you so much, Tim. This has been, I don't know. I wish I could articulate how the impact I think this has had on me. And I'll pray. I don't know sometimes who or what I'm praying to, but I will continue to pray for you to continuing to bless everyone that comes in your path with your unique perspective on the world. So thank you so much. And I'm going to Barnes and Noble to buy Baseball Genius.
Thanks, Josh. Appreciate it.
If you enjoyed today's episode, consider supporting the podcast for free by subscribing on your favorite podcast platform, leaving a review, and sharing it with your friends. Your support means the world to us. This episode of Nothing Left Unsaid is brought to you by 11 Labs. Their groundbreaking technology makes a huge difference, and we're grateful for their support. To learn more, visit 11labs.io. A substantial portion of our sponsorship proceeds go to tackleals.com, funding cutting-edge ALS research. If you'd like to join the fight and contribute, visit tackleals.com. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time on Nothing Left Unsaid.